You're all very, very welcome to this ISAG public meeting. The Independent Scientific Advocacy Group is a group of scientists, researchers, and academics who've come together and have been advocating for COVID elimination or SARS-CoV-2 elimination on the island of Ireland, both north and south. So usually at these weekly meetings, we concentrate on what we can do here on the island of Ireland towards COVID elimination. But we know, of course, that we need to act locally, but think globally, and indeed also act globally. And that's what today's public meeting is about, the issue of global vaccine equity. So I'd like to thank Professor Ivan Perry, who has organized this meeting for you and invited the speakers. We have superb speakers to explain the issue of global vaccine equity to you and what you can do about it yourselves. You can pose questions in the chat and in the question and answer on your Zoom, and I'll try and pick those up for you and pose them to the panel or to the speakers. Do indicate who you'd like to ask the question of. So before we turn to the issue of global vaccine equity, we'll just do our traditional situation update, and James Merrick will be presenting that. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, Helen. Agus Diagweev Akarjik. So the little synopsis this week before we look at the charts is that things are quite stable in Northern Ireland, kind of a continuation of what we've seen in recent weeks. And in the Republic, the cyber attack on the health service means all our data sources are offline, but we have a little bit of information we can talk about there. So if we could go into the slides, please, Ben. So this is Northern Ireland, and this is the chart we show every week. A linear scale the last few weeks. Daily average cases per 100,000 is the y-axis, and this is a relatively low level to some of the levels we've seen over the pandemic. And the black line here is the population average, and so it's this steady, slow decline, few bumps along the way, and the vaccination program is continuing apace in the north and in the south. So it's a few bumps in different age groups, but probably nothing definitive we can talk about. So Northern Ireland is a kind of a continuation as we've seen the last few weeks. If we go to the next slide, please, Ben. So in the Republic, unfortunately, we've no data to do our usual charts due to the cyber attack, as I said. But the case numbers that were announced are, and also indications from other sources like GP referrals, seem to indicate, kind of a similar level of virus incidence that we've seen, say, last week or two, in and around the 400 cases per day. And so as we've talked about before, there are things we can do to reduce that and make spaces safe. And I'll just go to the next slide, please. Final slide this week, so short, but this is and relevant to the discussion today. This is the global death toll over across the pandemic, recorded deaths, and of course in some countries, some regions, deaths will be recorded, in others are poorer or better recording systems. But this just gives an indication. So there's a couple of things I want to say. So I suppose in terms of the overall pandemic, the very peak of kind of daily average deaths was in early January, driven by Europe, North America. And then there was a sharp decline as deaths declined in North America and Europe, kind of early 2021, and then a sharp incline again, and that was driven by P1 variant in Brazil, and also the Asian bloc here. Well, much of Asia is zero COVID. We also have other countries there, and particularly recent surge, and we've heard about in the news. India and some of the neighboring countries have been a big story. The cases and deaths in India have seemed to have reached a crest in the last week or two. But in terms of the overall pandemic, we're still kind of the local story of falling deaths and increased vaccination kind of globally, we're still at, at a bad in the context of the whole pandemic. And I suppose just in the spirit of what Helen said of thinking globally and acting locally, the sort of rapid surge we've seen in Asia there on a micro scale, you can associate it with India. On a micro scale, if you look at places in England, some localities in England in the past few weeks, like Bolton, there's a rapid surge in case numbers driven by the same Indian variant, and which is obviously close to our own shores here in Ireland. So that's the context of the local case numbers and kind of global pandemic situation. Hopefully that sets us up for today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James, for setting that out. It's a pity that we have another global problem ongoing, a global data security problem, which has hit us this week in terms of the COVID data. As James said, at the moment we're in the particular situation in Ireland of opening up the economy while there's considerable uncertainty about the Indian variant, which at this stage would be arriving mainly via the UK, where it has been taking hold. But this emphasizes yet again the now well-known phrase, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And it's not only out of self-interest, of course, that we need to make sure that the COVID-19 pandemic is brought under control, and that requires vaccination. Self-interest should be secondary to fairness and our concern for the interests and indeed rights of other citizens globally. So the real problem is not whether the Indian variant comes here, but what has been happening and unfolding in India and indeed in many other countries where the vaccine rollout is not anywhere near as advanced as it is in Ireland, whether north or south. So in relation to these critical ethical issues, Dr. Mike Ryan of the WHO has stated, if we stand by and allow frontline health workers and vulnerable people in developing countries to not be vaccinated, while the rich North gets on with vaccinating perfectly healthy young people, then I hope the history books write that down. So that's a challenge for us to be discussing today. In response to these concerns, developing nations led by India and South Africa have proposed to the World Trade Organization that patents on vaccinations and other COVID-related items should be waived. A whole complex of issues, and I'm really delighted, therefore, to invite now Jim Clarken. Jim Clarken is the CEO of Oxfam Ireland and an executive director of Oxfam International. He's a leading commentator on global issues relating to human rights, inequality, sustainable development, and the rights of refugees and migrants. He's also a commissioner at the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and an adjunct professor at the School of Business and Law at UCC. So Jim is really uniquely qualified to talk on these issues to us. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you very much, Helen, and good afternoon, everyone. And could I just start by saying thank you so much to the Independent Scientific Advocacy Group for inviting Oxfam to be with you here today. Thank you especially, Dr. Ivan, for the invitation. It's always good for us to engage with experts in specific areas as we work through a very broad range of issues across Oxfam, and it's great to find new allies and new stakeholders that we can work with. And just to say that we really value the work that you have been doing over this past year or so. I think we're, as has been mentioned, we're all very grateful that Ireland's vaccine rollout is gathering speed, and that we can see our own society starting to open up here. That's really positive for all of us, and that's a really good thing. But it's, I think we're all very clear, and it's obvious from the presentation earlier that this global pandemic is far from over. Almost 100,000 people are dying of the virus every week in countries without sufficient access to the vaccine. Just 0.2% of the vaccines distributed so far have gone to low-income countries. And we estimate that 9 out of 10 people in many developing countries are unlikely to get a vaccine this year. The Economist Intelligence Unit reports that most of the world's poorest will have to wait until 2024 for mass immunization if we continue at this current trend. And this compares with high-income countries like this part of the world who have bought up enough potential doses to vaccinate their citizens several times over. So this global inequity is not only a catastrophic moral failure, but it's leading to needless suffering and loss of life. I was on a call last night with my global counterparts, discussing the situation. I was talking to people in South Africa who are having to deal with the third wave, but particularly my colleague Amitav Bihar in India, who was describing the situation there. And it was interesting to see what has been reported and the difference on the ground. The reported situation in India is that approximately 300,000 people have died from the disease. The estimates on the ground are that the reality is that it's between 3 and 10 times this official figure. So we're talking about millions of people have already died in India because of the disease, and making it probably the epicenter of the disease in the world. And they're dying. I mean, this colleague of mine who's seen friends of his die at the hospital steps, unable to access hospital, unable to get simple things like oxygen for want of that. That's what's causing the deaths. And Oxfam has published a report last year talking about the wider impacts of this and the potential for this to really reverse progress that has been made across the world in fighting poverty over the last 20 years. We estimate that 500 million people could be pushed into poverty if it continues at this rate. And inequality is likely to rise in every single country in the world, according to the IMF. So there's a lot at stake here. The ongoing outbreaks anywhere mean greater risks of new variants, as we've talked about, developing against which vaccines are not as effective. So there's just no way to defeat COVID in Ireland unless there's united action worldwide. The science is clear. People in developing countries need access to vaccines and treatments to achieve herd immunity in the same way that all of us do. And without global action, the health crisis and the resulting economic crisis here and worldwide will continue. It's interesting that a new International Chamber of Commerce report concluded that the current best case scenario, which is that wealthy countries will be fully vaccinated by the middle of this year, roughly, and poor countries largely shut out. This could cause economic losses globally exceeding $9 trillion. So nearly half of those costs will be absorbed by wealthy countries like Ireland and the EU. So, I mean, there's the self-interest argument there, Helen, versus obviously the human rights and fairness and justice issue. So they both come to play. And we say the solution to this is quite simple. We need a transformation in how vaccines are produced and distributed. The current approach of depending on a very small number of companies to vaccinate the world in an unequitable and untimely manner is not working. Pharmaceutical companies must allow the vaccines to be produced as widely as possible by sharing their technical knowledge and know-how free from patents. Governments must do everything in their power to ensure that COVID-19 vaccines are made a global public good, free of charge to the public, fairly distributed and based on need. And there are two main mechanisms by which this can happen. And Ben, if you could move on to this second slide there, please. Agreeing a waiver from certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement for the prevention, containment and treatment of COVID-19. This proposal is supported by more than 100 nations at the WTO. The TRIPS waiver was proposed by India and South Africa last October, and we're delighted to say that we were very heavily involved in the campaign in the US as Oxfam there, and now it's been supported by the Biden administration. The WTO agreement on trades-related aspects of intellectual property rights, TRIPS, requires WTO members to provide lengthy monopoly protections for medicines, tests, and the technology used to produce them. After a global campaign by public health and development groups in 2001, the WTO issued a binding declaration about better balancing TRIPS intellectual property protections and public health needs. A temporary emergency waiver is in line with the WTO members' agreement that intellectual property rules cannot create barriers to health treatments for diseases that unnecessarily cost human lives and undermine the global economy. The TRIPS waiver won't completely solve the problem, but it will allow for a temporary space within the WTO rules to empower governments to move quicker when accessing intellectual property protected technologies that are needed to protect public health. It'll also enable countries to avoid lengthy and costly legal hurdles to speed up product development, scale up manufacturing, and expand the supply of effective medical technologies, including drugs, vaccines, diagnostics, and other products, including ventilators and PPE. The second option is for vaccine makers to share vaccine production know-how and blueprints through the World Health Organization's COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, the so-called CTAP. This sets up a system to share data and know-how, cell lines, etc., in the spirit of solidarity, with the aim of increasing production capacity for COVID-19 vaccines, medicines, and diagnostics globally. The US President Joe Biden's recent announcement in support of waiving patents on COVID-19 vaccines to help increase global vaccination production is a massive step in the right direction. So too is the Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence report on global access to vaccines released in March this year, which recommended that Ireland formally endorses the WHO CTAP platform and do everything in its power to ensure that vaccine makers cooperate with this platform. However, no pharmaceutical company producing COVID-19 vaccines has expressed a willingness to take part in the CTAP platform. Ireland has yet to formally endorse CTAP, and we also know that some ministers have made positive statements broadly around the TRIPS waiver, but the government position is still that it's firmly opposed and in line with the EU position. This is hugely dangerous for the billions of unvaccinated people around the world, because the reasons put forward by Irish leaders to support this approach, they just simply don't stand up to scrutiny. This is why Oxfam Ireland, along with a number of other NGOs, faith organisations, trade unions, medical organisations, have proposed that a relevant Oireachtas committee, either the EU or Enterprise Trade and Employment Group, undertake a detailed review of Ireland's position on the TRIPS waiver as a matter of urgency. We plan to launch a People's Vaccine campaign in Ireland in June and to put pressure on Irish decision makers to ensure that these proposals are given proper parliamentary scrutiny. I think it's important to address the main issues put forward for maintaining the status quo. If you could move to slide 3, please, Ben. So the first argument, patents, intellectual property rights are necessary incentives for pharmaceutical companies to keep innovating. You could argue this in the current system for the production of many essential drugs. And there's a wider discussion to be had around that, and certainly organizations such as Access to Medicines have been campaigning on these issues, and we need to relook at how we develop life-saving drugs and other medicines, and how, what's the involvement of the state, the involvement of pharma companies, and so on. But in this instance, it's very specific that, well, first of all, we have to celebrate the fact that scientists around the world, perform miracles to develop the COVID vaccine so quickly. But vital to remember that they did this in a large part because over $100 billion of dollars of public money was invested in it. It was public money, not patents, that was responsible for innovation. And it was public money, not pharmaceutical corporations, that's taken the bulk of the risk. Also important to remember that the prize for developing these vaccines is a global market that is huge and will continue to be huge. So there were very little risk from a pharma point of view, and the investment came from the public, the public purse. We all shared in the making of the vaccine, and we should all share in the benefits. Moreover, this proposal is just for the length of the pandemic. So we are talking about a temporary waiver, and companies will still be able to make huge profits from the sale of the vaccines. Another argument is that there's no idle vaccine production capacity. This is not the case. Companies in Israel, Canada, Bangladesh, South Korea, and Pakistan have all tried in vain to obtain the rights to increase production of COVID-19 vaccines, but have been unable to do so. Knowledge Ecology International has identified at least 144 manufacturing facilities in 35 countries that could potentially be used to manufacture COVID-19 vaccines. If we had an open system with distributed manufacturing, tech transfer and intellectual property was waived. The Global South doesn't have the capacity or know-how to produce more vaccines. Recently, Tánaiste Leo Varadkar stated, "A few countries in the Global South have the infrastructural know-how very few countries have the infrastructural know-how or the materials to make those vaccines. And there's no point in giving somebody a recipe if they don't have the kitchen or the cooking skills or the ingredients. Setting aside the racist undertones of that assertion, we do know that there are already manufacturers making safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines and medicines in South Africa, India, and Brazil. Indeed, India is often described as the pharmacy to the world. There's plenty more qualified capacity that we can draw on from Bangladesh to Senegal to Vietnam. It's simply not true that the expertise for high quality production doesn't exist in the global south. For example, in response to a recent call made by the WHO for manufacturers interested in making the mRNA vaccines in developing countries, 50 companies stepped forward. It's disappointing that such evidence-free statements last used during the HIV/AIDS crisis 2 decades ago are being recycled by our leaders. We must remember that during the HIV/AIDS pandemic, affordable treatment was denied to people with HIV in poor nations and millions died needlessly as a result. Another argument is that a licensing approach will work best. The Taoiseach reportedly favours a fair licensing system to increase production capacity, but it is unclear what is meant by this, as no proposals have been put forward. If it's a proposal for more bilateral closed-door commercial deals in the same vein as the current exclusive licensing model, it will continue to fail to secure greater access to developing countries where there's more limited profit to be made. A key flaw in such an approach is that the global response to the pandemic would remain in the hands of a small number of companies who will continue to decide how many vaccines are made, who they are sold to, and for what price. The COVAX facility has been set up to deal with this issue. COVAX is a welcome and vital process, but it needs massive expansion. It alone is struggling to meet the scale of the need. Even if it meets its own goals, only 20% of people in developing countries dependent on it will get the dose by the end of the year. Research by the People's Vaccine Alliance suggests that'll be more likely to be 10%. The WHO has repeatedly said that the issue lies with inadequate vaccine production. Another argument is that the US should end its own export bans on vaccines and materials. Yes, of course, the US should end its export ban, but this shouldn't be an excuse to stand in opposition to the waiver of IP on COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. We can't allow this to be used as a lever in some broader trade disputes with the US, between the US and Europe or other parts of the world. The continued existence of export bans actually shows how important it is that we manufacture vaccines in distributed sites all over the world. And the key in doing this is the ending of pharmaceutical monopolies and to ensure the sharing of vaccine technology. Quality cannot be assured. An often heard argument, again bringing back memories of the days of the AIDS treatment crisis, when you opened up IP, you cannot quality control. Assuring quality of vaccines is essential, but it has little to do with protection of intellectual property. To ensure that COVID vaccines are of assured quality, the WHO runs a COVID-19 pre-qualification program where producers must submit their products for assessment. Negotiations on an IP waiver will take too long. This is a very spurious reason for not supporting the TRIPS waiver, given that negotiations have been stalled at the WTO by Ireland and the EU, amongst others, since October 2020. We've lost 7 or 8 months already when a proposal was first put forward by South Africa and India. The quick conclusion of a negotiation is dependent on blockers like Ireland and the EU ending unacceptable delaying tactics. Next slide, please. Waiving patents will not increase vaccine production. It's true that waiving IP alone is not the only step, but it is essential. Producing a vaccine is a complex process and requires access to the intellectual property, but also direct transfer of technology, knowledge, and in some cases, materials. Closing the know-how gap requires proactive technology sharing, a reasonable proposition, considering that the technology was developed thanks to massive amount of public funding. Materials and inputs are a key bottleneck. A TRIPS waiver will not address this. There is a need to scale up inputs, but the ability to do this is also constrained by IP protections. For example, bioreactor bags, a key tool in medicine and vaccine production, are in short supply, but this is because of monopoly IP protections that cover these. Vaccine production is constrained more by monopolistic legal structures than physical supply limits. So the waiver will actually help, not hinder, more inputs to be produced. And governments need to coordinate to make the investments needed in this scale-up. There's no need for a TRIPS waiver, as countries can use a compulsory licensing system. Compulsory licensing is not a suitable mechanism to deliver global equitable access for vaccines, given the need for know-how rather than just IP, which isn't covered by compulsory licensing. Developing countries are being reasonable, legal and proactive in demanding access to all knowledge they need in a genuine global public health emergency to gain more affordable doses. The vaccines are protected by a steel gate of multiple patents and licenses, and seeking compulsory licenses alone will be time-consuming, complex, and there are considerable legal obstacles around many countries effectively using them. Countries don't have the time or the legal resource to pursue this path in an emergency. Indeed, even in Ireland, we do not have the capacity to fully find a usable framework for compulsory licensing. As a result, no country has applied for a compulsory licensing to produce COVID-19 vaccines, despite the global pandemic. Oxfam undertook polling on the issue back in March, and the Irish public is firmly behind the call for a people's vaccine. Over 6 in 10 people want an end to monopolies on vaccine production and want the government to ensure companies share vaccine science and technology with other approved companies around the world. Only 18% of people in Ireland support the government's current approach of protecting pharmaceutical companies' monopoly on COVID-19 vaccines. This is really an argument for our time. I mean, it is the most significant health crisis of our lifetime. We need to be on the right side of history, ensuring that we did everything we could to save and protect lives across the world. The time is now, the time for a people's vaccine, for removing artificial barriers that are ultimately going to result in mass death, suffering, destroying economies both here and across the world for years and years to come, where the solution is staring us in the face. We have to push for a people's vaccine. Thank you. Last slide there, please. So that was the attitude all those years ago. Obviously, there's a greater complexity in the way that these are developed now, but the principle remains the same.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that very powerful, illuminating talk on the situation. As you say, we need to keep on the right side of history, and it's very sobering to understand that our governments aren't ensuring that that's the case in such an urgent situation. I'll open things up for discussion, but first of all, let's turn to our second speaker for today and then come back to the discussion session. Our second speaker is Dr. Shubhangi Karmakar, and she's an incoming academic intern in St. James's Hospital, Dublin, and an outgoing vice president of the Association of Medical Students in Ireland, a keen scientific ethicist of Trinity College, Dublin. Dr. Karmakar has been advocating on public health accessibility for the last 6 years. She writes widely as a journalist and columnist on matters of public health care, technology, communication, and data security. Thank you very much, Shubhangi. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Professor Perry, and I'd also like to thank Maha Rivas, who is an Irish Paraguayan lawyer and human rights advocate, who helped invite me to be here today. I suppose there is little in the way of fact that I would have liked to share with you that Mr. Clarken didn't share there very eloquently, and that hasn't been shared before. But I've been very grateful for all the notes that have been touched on today, that when it comes to vaccination, we might die as Irish people or Indian people, but we live and die as people. And so in terms of vaccine equity and vaccine development, the global interest must vastly outweigh self-interest, whether that's of a corporation, whether that's of a national identity. I've greatly appreciated all the statistical framing that speakers have provided you with so far, and I suppose I'm here to discuss more of the emotive costs and the personal costs that come with watching a country burn, not with a forest fire, perhaps, not with what we might consider a natural disaster, but a country that is burning and burning with thousands of funeral pyres a day, which had its highest death rate yesterday. So I contributed recently to an article in the journal calling on the fact that India needs systematic help and not symptomatic help. This piece was focused on calling for the TRIPS waiver, which we have discussed, and thank you actually to Mr. Clarken for providing the alternative of the endorsement of CTAP, which I think is also a systematic approach to tackling greater access to vaccine equity in India and also notably in other countries that are not covered by the English-speaking news, not covered by English-speaking media or in the Western world. And the crux of that article had to do with the fact that, yes, absolutely, people are dying on the steps of hospitals and we need oxygen. We need to be sending symptomatic help. We need to be sharing all the information that we can about bed details and access to public and private hospitals. But the crux of the matter is, there is no point prolonging that suffering. There is no point prolonging the hospital delays. There's no point prolonging painful lives and very short, very rapid deaths when the answer to what can be done about it more decisively is staring right at us. One of the arguments that Mr. Clarken touched on was, even if something like TRIPS waiver went through, that the underdeveloped parts of the world would not be able to produce drugs for themselves. Arguments such as this aren't true, and they aren't new. They've been held publicly about viral diseases before. Bob Herbert, in his New York Times column in 2001, quoted the head of the Agency for International Development in America, saying that many Africans don't know what Western time is, that they did not know how to take antiretroviral drugs for AIDS. Many people in Africa have never seen a clock or a watch in their entire lives. Arguments like this are not only reprehensible, but also untrue. And within only a short 5 years since that crisis, using a definition of good adherence, 82% of people in the African continent succeeded at taking their medication, succeeded at transporting their medication, succeeded at delivering medication to the most underserved parts of the continent and its countries, compared to only a 55% adherence among North Americans. By parallel of India and India's capacity to produce vaccines and distribute them, I can only speak to my experience as growing up there as a child, watching cold chains being distributed to the most underserved villages in India with my mother, who was a public clinician there. I can attest to watching the polio vaccine given. I can attest to watching vaccines being given and taking pretty much every vaccine there was, because there isn't nearly as much reticence. There isn't nearly as much challenge to good delivery and good distribution and good development of vaccines as there is resistance in the Western world to helping India do that, or to helping indeed any country in the underdeveloped parts of the world do that. But if we acknowledge that, what becomes the challenge is realizing how much we see those people over there as us people in the world. What becomes a challenge is the fact that a consultant in a hospital here cannot see my cousins who are junior doctors in India who have yet to receive a first dose of any vaccine. And this is true for the leading postgraduate hospital in India, let alone any of their patients. What they do not see when we talk about, relaxing our regulations because we've had enough, because we want to visit people for Christmas, because we want to give our grandmothers a hug, is that my grandparents in India, whom I haven't seen in 5 years, haven't received any hospital care for the last 2 years due to COVID, and because not isolating completely and risking going to a hospital would mean that they would almost certainly, one of them, contract COVID and potentially die from it. Because in Kolkata, the current prevalence of COVID infections is 55%. So I could give you facts again. I could give you arguments again. I could tell you that India in January had already planned to supply over 160 million of doses of COVID vaccines to 60 countries, that they'd included 10 million in gifts to neighboring countries, and 4.5 million of the AstraZeneca vaccines being manufactured for Brazil and Morocco. But those are numbers that have already been given to you before, and I'm not sure that anything I can tell you about the numbers of hardworking people we have in India, the numbers of doctors who are struggling to cope personally, the numbers of people who are dying and dying and dying, whom we as medical students here, whom we as doctors here are never going to see again after years and years of waiting. I could give you many numbers, but I don't know that that could impress upon anybody the importance of putting global interest above self-interest, of genuinely putting anybody rather than a desire to helping every person whose story you can understand. When I contributed to the article in the journal, I'd said, watching a week of relentless death was particularly difficult for students here and for doctors here. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about this. I'm just giving a lecture. So sorry. But yeah, I said at the time it was 1 week. Now and people are still dying and the deaths are still increasing. And we need to stop seeing India as a warning. We need to stop thinking that closing our borders is a challenge, observing restrictions in Ireland is a challenge, that anything but zero COVID is acceptable, when the only thing that we can really do now is keep each other safe around the world and rectify some of the massive global health inequality by calling on our government, by calling on our representatives to the world, to the UN Security Council, to the WHO, and asking them to support CTAP and TRIPS waiver. Because we need to equip everybody to be self-reliant in being safe, rather than relying on philanthropy, rather than relying on somebody else to come in and give us charity to do the task. The future relies on mutual aid and not charity, and on empowerment, not just providing resources out of pity. And I hope that as Ireland, we feel equipped to move forward in taking tangible steps in addressing this systematic inequality, not just for India and not just for Ireland, but for every country across the world, for those we don't see in here as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Shubhangi. Again, a very powerful and eloquent emphasis on the importance of putting global interests above self-interests. And again, emphasizing that the solution is staring us right in the face, as you both said, and it's a matter of acting on that solution. We know what to do, and we need to get on and make that happen, and make that happen fast. I'd like to turn now to Ivan Perry to say a few words and start the discussion. Ivan.
Thank you, Helen. And I just would like to start by thanking Jim and Shubhangi for really eloquent and detailed and very moving presentations. And I think Shubhangi, in the last thing she said, there, that it's not charity. It's a question of mutual aid and mutual interest. It's really about recognizing our interconnectedness and our interdependence on this small planet that we share, and about really beginning to face head on the stark failure of our current neoliberal capitalist global model that of course even before the pandemic has brought us to the edge of the precipice with the climate emergency. And I suppose just to come back to in a way, I suppose for us in Ireland as the centre of the global pharma sector, it's really shocking how much in thrall we are as a people, that our government is to the pharma sector, and the fact that we are opposing the TRIPS waiver is shocking. The fact that we are not using our moral authority and our position as our seat on the UN Security Council to really drive forward this agenda. And as I say, and I'm sure Jim and Shubhangi would comment on this, this is not a new agenda. People like Paul Farmer, the anthropologist in Harvard, have been writing about global inequity in infectious disease for decades. People like Peter Singer, the ethicists, have written and talked about this for decades. So these are not new issues, but I think we're at a moment of truth, a moment of action, rather than just further talk.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ivan. Exactly. And your last comment brings us to the first question to take from the audience, which, if I could pose that to both Jim and Shubhangi, what should people do? What should members of the public do? Are there practical things that people watching this public meeting could do now to support the TRIPS waiver and move the situation forward? Jim, if I could ask you first.
Sure, thanks. Look, I think oftentimes we get a sense as individuals that we're helpless in this huge global complex machine that seems to be out of our control and out of our individual power to influence. But that's never true, and we see this as a campaigning organization all the time. And I mentioned, and you know, we never try to attribute a success specifically to ourselves. It's to do with being in coalition with other organizations and being involved in other spaces. But the campaign in the US was a people-led campaign. 2 million people signed that campaign that put pressure on Joe Biden and his people to change their position. We can do the same here. And it's much easier in Ireland because you can access your local TD very, very easily. And TDs, the one thing they do listen to is their constituents. So wherever anybody on this call is at, if they write a simple letter to their TD saying, look, it's unacceptable that Ireland is not supporting the TRIPS waiver. We believe in it because it's a global solidarity issue, because it's a global need, because it's the right thing to do, because it must happen. TDs will listen, and we will be putting pressure as an organization, both Oxfam and others who are involved in our alliance, on Parliament to convene discussions hopefully at these Oireachtas meetings to discuss these issues. And if the parliamentarians in those meetings have a stack of, or a virtual stack of communications from their constituents, they listen and they will move. It works. It really does. And you know, what I tried to do in the course of my presentation was try to to kind of dismiss some of the counter arguments, because they're very spurious, as I hope that became clear. But they are very much a script. There's a script being provided to parliamentarians from the industry, and we need to counteract that script, and that's what we need. That's why I felt it was important to do that. But the answer is in the people's ability to influence politicians.
Yeah, thank you. Shubhangi, would you like to add to that in terms of what people can actively do?
Yeah, so I definitely agree that writing to your TDs, writing to even people who are our representatives on the international stage may have some effect. We are very lucky that we have Dr. Mike Ryan at the WHO. We are very lucky to have a strong Irish representative voice that is calling for greater collaboration on global vaccine equity already. Citing experts matters, and citing personal stories matters. So certainly through AMSI, we will be sharing words from international student doctors or international junior doctors. I think as clinicians, we have a particular role in all standing up to unequivocally call for TRIPS waiver. I know in Ireland there's a certain degree of hesitance, particularly around clinicians who believe that Ireland doesn't have a global say, or Ireland's say doesn't matter. Convincing those doctors, speaking to clinicians, speaking to every person about the importance of this. And I also suppose speaking in an original way, because I certainly find one of the issues with trying to write to your TD as a national campaign often leads to copy-pasted letters being shared, which eventually become easily ignored by spam filters. I think writing something original, giving it some thought why the health of the world matters to you and why everybody being equal matters to you is also really important. And then in terms of, I suppose, symptomatic help, there are several collated documents around mutual aid in India that are all over the internet. I know Declan Cashin, who is one of the coordinators at Twitter in the UK, has a regularly updated resource pooling every current piece of Indian mutual aid. Every Indian mutual aid campaign that's running. So seeing if you can contribute to those also makes a meaningful difference, because we do know that health inequality spans economic inequality as well. We know that around the Western world, those of us who are migrants, those of us who are Indian or from the underdeveloped parts of the world, do get paid less. And more often than not, it's us who are doing our own mutual aid. If you do have some spare resources to give to mutual aid, I highly recommend you getting in touch and finding out what works best on the local level. Because even in the most rural parts of India, they have effective mutual aid programs running that just need support.
That's excellent. Thank you, Shubhangi and Jim. That gives a good idea of what people can start to do. I think people like to think that they're actually doing something and not just increasing their understanding of the issue. A related question really that came for the audience is, why is the Irish government not endorsing the TRIPS waiver and endorsing CTAPs? Jim, I wonder whether you can explain a little bit more what their objections are, and that would help, of course, people get over those objections.
Yeah, to be honest, we're not 100% clear. I mean, they have taken the standard stance that the EU has taken, but we're as Oxfam, we're campaigning across Europe on this. So we have sister organisations in multiple European countries, and we're seeing cracks in government lines across Europe, and we've seen it here at home too, where certain ministers have suggested in some other language that they would be very open to this. Minister Coveney certainly made reference to it, as did Minister Troy. So we can only assume that there are some concerns in relation to the dependency that Ireland has on the industry here. Let's not pretend that doesn't exist, and Dr. Perry raised that earlier on. But I think upsetting the status quo seems to be a problem for politicians here, and I mean that's just not acceptable. We have a situation that's unprecedented. We have a need that is dire and growing, and we have a solution that's staring us in the face, which won't cause this idea that the whole global pharma industry will collapse. It won't. I mean, pharma companies here will make large amounts of profit anyway, and that's fine, but there's no reason that they should be stopping the production of vaccines in very large numbers. And the only way around this is to produce vaccines in very large numbers and get them into people's arms now. That's the only way we're going to get through this. And if we don't, we're going to see first of all, there's going to be tragic circumstances across developing countries, as I mentioned, in terms of global development overall, economic development and health, and the knock-on implications of education and everything else. We're going to set the world back by 10 years at least, and we're going to set it into an economic downward spiral that's completely unnecessary. So they're all good reasons for doing this, all good self-interest reasons, and I'd never advocate for those, but they exist for Ireland and Europe. And we're now the last block on this, more or less. If Ireland and Europe could agree to this, it would happen very quickly. So I think we need to be forceful and direct with the leadership here, and we need to push really hard. So that's and I do think it's possible.
Yeah, thank you, Shubhangi. Would you like to add to that?
Yes, briefly. I think what we need to compel people into action is perhaps not just to understand why the government won't advocate for this. We've seen our government hold regressive stances in the EU with regards to the rights of migrants and people from other underdeveloped countries at several instances. I think at this point, eliciting the precise phrases for why they are not doing it is perhaps less important than imparting on the government by any means possible that we're all only as strong as our weakest link. If Ireland's COVID status, or if Ireland's zero COVID status, is only as good as the next flight from somewhere with a high-risk new variant coming in, we're not safe. And we won't be until everyone's safe. And it's not a meaningless tautology. It's not a cute little phrase to throw out. It's a very important thing for experts as well as laypersons to impress on the government that we possibly don't have time to decipher the excuses, to find out why exactly the help isn't being given. Right now, we need to impart on them that if we are blocking TRIPS waiver, or if we're not endorsing CTAP, we are the weakest link, and we will actively be undermining our safety and our threat to global safety thereafter.
Thank you, Shubhangi. I'd like to turn now to another question, which perhaps, if I'm right, Gabriel Scully would like to pose regarding vaccinations to the younger people in Ireland. Is that right, Gabriel?
Well, actually, I wanted to come in on that issue of the pharmaceutical industry, if I may, because I regard it as really, really important. I mean, one of the reasons that it is problematical for the cabinet to consider these matters is that they know, a bit like the airline industry, there are important industries in Ireland, but I don't believe in those. Those businesses don't believe Ireland should be enthralled to them, should be the servant of those businesses. The government should be the servant of the people in Ireland. And Ireland has such a fantastic record of action internationally. It's the country in the world with the longest unbroken record of contribution to UN peacekeeping missions. There is hardly a disaster or catastrophe in the world where, when you listen to the coverage of it, you don't hear an Irish voice talking. And Irish people make a fantastic contribution internationally and care. And we have moved so far as a people from putting pennies in collection boxes to seeing Ireland as an international force for good. And here is our real opportunity to make that come true. I don't believe some of the things that the pharmaceutical industry is putting forward as excuses and putting those out to the politicians. If there is a shortage of vaccine manufacturing capacity, which I don't believe there is, but if there is such a thing, well, how does that inhibit removing the waiver? It would simply mean that none would be made. But therefore, what has the pharmaceutical industry to fear from that? If there is a shortage of components and it's not going to be possible to make all these vaccines in other countries, well, lift the waiver, because if they are right, there won't be extra vaccine manufactured. But we know those aren't true, and we know those excuses aren't true. So what should happen and what should be used to change the minds? Well, I completely agree with what Jim said. Everyone should be writing and contacting their TDs, and the Dáil, the people's representative, the Dáil, that body, should make the decision on behalf of the people of Ireland to do the right thing.
Thank you, Gabriel. I'd like to turn now to Clare. I think, Clare, did you want to address the issue of younger people's vaccines?
I didn't. I don't have something to say about it myself. I wondered if anybody else had input on this very tricky issue of, given the fact that we are steadily working our way through the more vulnerable populations and towards younger people with no underlying health issues. How do we weigh up that question of when we should share our vaccine supply with other parts of the world? And I wondered if anyone else on the panel or Jim or Shubhangi had thoughts on it.
Jim, should we be vaccinating the young people in Ireland before we've sent our vaccines to other countries?
Well, I think the problem here is the way we're seeing this. The idea that we're sending vaccines from here, the idea that it's a charity, we're giving the bits that are left over, and here you go, poor people in poor parts of the world. Aren't we great? We're great, Ireland. We're doing this thing. And I should say, what Dr. Scally said earlier on is absolutely correct. Ireland has traditionally played such a strong role in so many spaces, development spaces, over such a long period of time. But we need to evolve that. We need to constantly evolve what that means. And it doesn't mean giving the bits that are left over. I think it was Chelsea Clinton in her institution said donating 80 million vaccine doses without a plan to scale up production worldwide is like putting a Band-Aid on a machete wound. We can't donate our way out of a pandemic. So it's, the answer to this isn't deciding somebody gets it and somebody doesn't. The answer to this is everybody gets it. Everybody needs to get it, and everybody needs to get it as fast as possible. The current global manufacturing capacity just simply isn't there amongst the companies that have, we as a public have invested heavily in the development of these drugs. Isn't what the scientific community have done. It's a wonderful thing. Now, why don't we just make sure that the entire world has access to this free and quickly? And it's very possible. It's very doable. They're political blockages. That's what they are, that are in the way here, and we need to knock them aside.
Yeah, absolutely. Shubhangi, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I have to say, as a young person who is now vaccinated, it makes me feel incredibly guilty for my family who are working in hospitals in India. But yeah, I think the zero-sum question is flawed. I faced quite a lot of the zero-sum question when the journal article came out, when Ireland, said we're sending so many oxygen tankers that we don't need to India. And, even like clinicians at the time saying, oh, so if you don't agree with symptomatic help, should we just withhold them? Surely giving people tankers isn't a bad thing. Aren't we being good? It's like, I don't think that being good should stand in the way of being better. I think that we have the capacity to be better in a meaningful sense. And I think I absolutely agree with Jim that a lot of these barriers are political and they are entrepreneurial, if not economic. And yeah, the future of the world, the future of a healthy world, isn't philanthropy that donates, 1% of its profits to a cause and then pats itself on the back. And it isn't sort of seeing India as the next like trocar box kid, for want of a better word, as this sort of underprivileged, incapable country full of incapable people who can't work their way out of this, because incapable people aren't dying. Indian doctors are dying. People who work in manufacturing in India are dying. Indian journalists are dying. Indian scientists are dying. It's not that India is dying because it's incapable. India and other countries not reported on by English-speaking media are dying because they're not being given the tools to survive. And I think that's the crux of the matter. We have to work on a mutual aid basis that actively strives for global empowerment, not just to keep tiding people over until the next letdown.
Thank you. Thank you, Shubhangi. Absolutely. We have the capacity to be better. We can take that away from this seminar. We don't have very much time left. So I know there was a question from the audience about the numbers of the Indian variant. Is there anybody from the panel who'd like to take that before we close? I don't see on my little screen a hand. In that case, I'm sure it'll come up next week's seminar, when we'll have more of the numbers locally. But I need to bring this to a close. I'd like to thank very much Jim Clarken and Shubhangi Karmakar for their incredibly powerful calls to action. I think we've seen how people can act themselves within Ireland, and the importance of not thinking that you're powerless in Ireland to change the situation worldwide. It's up to us all to be part of this change. I'd like to think that we'll come to look back with pride rather than regret and shame at these discussions that we're having now, and that we'll be able to invite you back in a few months' time, and you could report on the incredible positive progress that we've made. This is a really urgent situation. I hope the listeners to this seminar will go away and act on it as soon as they click the leave button, and that we'll see action worldwide towards global vaccine equity. We've heard really how fundamentally important that is to us all. So thank you very much to you all, and to the panel, and to Ivan Perry for organising this seminar, and wish you well to the next seminar. Thank you very much.